way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but freed people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
Welcome everyone, back once again for the Cali Reparations Task Force Report Marathon Read, Monday through Friday, 8:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. This is Chapter 7, Racism in Environment and Infrastructure. Let's see, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but before we do that, there are some things I want to talk about here. So, check us out once again this Sunday, October 23rd. In the Mass Media Group will be going over the midterm here in California, as well as other important state races that will impact America as a whole, and also specifically the freedmen community. So check this out, and please like, share, subscribe, send it out. This is going to be a great build, very informational. And also you might be bringing some information to the table as well. Try to see if we can have a call in as well. Some phone lines open to hear from the family. So we'll see if we can make that happen. Then we had a great build with a brother named Milagro Jones down in Los Angeles at the California Reparations Task Force. Another phenomenal brother in the community. So, if you didn't see the live stream of the California Reparations Task Force, then you definitely have a chance to check this brother out, Milagro. He had a public commentary that was very powerful. So we definitely wanted to sit down with him, and we had a chance to sit down with him to speak further about his quest and his journey in his life. So that's another behind the scenes. And if you didn't know what BTS means, that means behind the scenes. It's real out in these reparation streets, the road to reparations. This is episode 7. And in this episode, when we sit down with Milagro, we specifically focus on education, which ironically, we spoke about education in chapter 6 of the read the past 2 days. But in this read, we'll be talking about racism in environment and infrastructure. This will be chapter 7, racism, environment, and infrastructure. So once again, family, let's get into it, shall we? So let me go ahead and pull up the document so we can get busy here. And let's see. Let's get into it. Chapter 7, Racism in Environment and Infrastructure. Introduction. The legacy of slavery, legal segregation, and government policies known as redlining have created environmental impacts that have harmed and continue to harm African Americans. Okay, family, before I continue, I just need to check my volume settings just to make sure that everything is working. Test 1, test 2. Yes, looks like we are good to go. Test 1, test 2. Yes, just wanted to make sure we had volume, and we are good. All right, so let's do it. First, government policies force African Americans to live in poor quality housing, exposing them to disproportionate amounts of lead poisoning and increasing the risk of disease, including COVID-19. Outside of their homes, African Americans are also exposed to far more pollutants than white Americans, partially because redlining explicitly grouped African Americans and other inharmonious racial groups with polluting sources. Second, government actors developed infrastructure projects like highways and parks in ways that destroyed and segregated Black communities, and also failed to provide or repair public services like sewage lines and water pipes. Finally, African Americans in their homes are more vulnerable than white Americans to the dangerous effects of extreme weather patterns like heat waves, disparities which are made worse by climate change. Section 3 of this chapter addresses the substandard housing and overcrowding problems faced by African Americans throughout American history caused by government practices, including redlining. Section 4 of this chapter discusses environmental pollutants to which African Americans are exposed as a result of similar and related government practices, which disproportionately continues to subject African Americans to hazardous waste management, oil and gas production, automobile and diesel fumes. Section 5 addresses the discriminatory choices that by government actors in implementing infrastructure, development, and related public services, which constantly have disadvantaged African Americans. Section 6 addresses the discriminatory practices of climate change, which are experienced disproportionately by African Americans or a result of government actions, policies that have imposed their harms on them. Section 2, standardized housing and overcrowding. Ain't that the truth? Throughout American history and to this day, African Americans have lived in housing of worse quality than white Americans and paid more to live in it. Nationally, starting in the early 20th century, as African Americans primarily rented housing in urban areas, they were constantly charged higher rates than white people. Before the Federal Fair Housing Act made housing discrimination based on race illegal, landlords would freely admit that they needed to charge Black renters higher rent because white renters did not want to share an apartment building with African Americans. To pay for the higher rents, Black families often took in lodgers or shared apartments, which created additional overcrowding. Real quick pause. I mean, even to this day, family, we got grandma and them, we got uncle and them, we got auntie and them, sister and them, brother and them, and them and them, all of them, still even to this day, just because we're under resourced. And I don't know if that had I don't know if the pandemic had anything to do with that as well, but that's just something to note. Continue. As of 2010, about 2.6 million, 7.5% non-Hispanic Black people, and 5.9 million white people, 2.8%, live in substandard housing in America, which is defined largely in relation to the housing's susceptibility to waterborne and airborne communicable diseases. Black households are almost twice as likely as white households to lack indoor plumbing nationwide. Black households are more poorly ventilated than white households in general, leading to excess moisture that supports the growth of mold and vermin, which can lead to or exacerbate asthma and other breathing issues. Black families also still experience overcrowded housing, generally defined as either having more than 1.5 or more than 2 persons per room living in a household, at 3 times the rates of white Americans. Overcrowded housing is linked with physical and mental health problems, including higher rates of exposure to household lead poisoning. This association may be correlative rather than causative, since overcrowded housing is more likely to be older housing and also more likely to house low-income workers in heavy industries that may cause them to bring lead dust and other contaminants into the household. Overcrowding has similarly shown to increase the risk of spread of infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, diarrhea, and infectious respiratory illnesses. At least one recent study demonstrated that overcrowding and other poor housing conditions correlated with greater rates of COVID-19 infections across the country, as well as increased mortality from COVID-19. Overcrowded housing also is linked with various mental health issues, including psychological distress, alcohol abuse, depression, and sleep disorders. Living in overcrowded housing is also associated with social withdrawal and feelings of helplessness, as well as an increase in hostility among household residents due to the lack of privacy and time to oneself. Overcrowded housing also harms school performance for children, which has lasting impact on their educational attainment. Living in a house with too many people makes it difficult to find a quiet place to study and even a quiet place to sleep. Children in crowded houses are more likely to catch the infectious diseases from others in their household, making it more likely for the child to stay home from school. Children from overcrowded homes are more likely to be held back a grade. They show reduced math and reading test scores, and they demonstrate higher rates of disruptive behaviors according to teachers. Moreover, some international research has found that children and adolescents in overcrowded housing are more likely to engage in violent behavior in the home, as well as to be victims of sexual abuse. California displays the same racial disparities regarding overcrowded housing as the rest of America. The most recent data provided by the California Department of Public Health reveals that Black Californians are approximately 2.5 times more likely to live in housing considered overcrowded and 2.8 times more likely to live in housing considered severely overcrowded compared to white Californians. Black Californians have also been forced to live in substandard housing, sometimes as a direct result of government action. One historical example is the federal government's buildings of public housing in Richmond to accommodate ship workers during World War II, which was officially and explicitly segregated. As part of those efforts, the federal government put programs in place that enabled white workers to access permanent residential housing, but offered Black workers no permanent housing. While some Black workers were able to find low-quality, long-term housing in areas of the East Bay, others lived in barns, minimal shelter like tents or cardboard shacks, or even without any shelter in open fields. In California specifically, the problem of overcrowded housing has been linked to the rapid spread of COVID-19 in neighborhoods with a higher number of Black residents, such as South Los Angeles. Neighborhoods with overcrowded housing in California have rates of COVID-19 that are 3.7 times higher than neighborhoods without crowded housing. Environmental pollutants. U.S. government policies, as discussed in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, pinned African Americans into poor neighborhoods with polluting industries, garbage dumps, and other sources of toxic health harms. Local governments zoned Black neighborhoods as industrial instead of residential, specifically to segregate Black residents from white residents. White neighborhoods frequently were zoned by local entities to explicitly ensure that few industrial or polluting business could locate within them. Again, pushing environmental pollution into Black neighborhoods. Redlined and segregated Black neighborhoods were cheaper for polluting industries to build on. This became a downward spiral. The more garbage dumps and sewer treatment plants a neighborhood had, the cheaper the land was, and the more likely the other polluting industries would move in. Without access to the mortgages and loans available to white Americans, Black homeowners also had less money to maintain and improve their homes, which made housing conditions worse and prevented African Americans from moving away from polluting sources. Black communities across the country still experience higher rates of pollution and the negative health outcomes caused by exposure of pollutants. African Americans are exposed to greater pollution from virtually every polluting source when compared to white Americans, including hazardous waste, heavy industry, vehicle traffic, and construction, all of which can be partially attributed to redlining and other historical discrimination. One source of pollution that has been continuously prevalent in Black communities is hazardous waste sites. The pollution has been shown to correlate with increased rates of asthma, cancer, lung disease, and heart disease. For example, in 2020, the New York Times Magazine profiled the story of Kylan Johnson, a Black resident of Philadelphia who developed asthma as a child and eventually developed gallbladder cancer after growing up in a largely Black neighborhood proximate to hazardous waste facilities and oil refineries. After recovering from surgery and chemotherapy, Johnson and a neighbor documented over 24 close relatives who were diagnosed with some form of cancer, many rare and many at unusually young ages. African Americans have long been disproportionately exposed to these harms. As of 1983, approximately 3 out of every 4 communities in which hazardous waste landfills were found were predominantly Black. In 1991, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, known as EPA, acknowledged that a disproportionate number of toxic waste facilities were found in Black neighborhoods throughout the country. More recently, a study in 2007 analyzed 38 states and found that African Americans disproportionately live in neighborhoods that host hazardous waste facilities and are twice as likely to live near a hazardous waste facility. As of 2020, African Americans are still 75% more likely to live near facilities that handle hazardous waste. Moreover, studies have shown that the EPA's handling of toxic waste cleanup sites, i.e. so-called Superfund sites, that's F-U-N-D, Superfund sites, or former industrial sites polluted with dangerous levels of hazardous waste, has consistently favored white communities over minority communities, and an external audit of the handling of discrimination complaints by the EPA determined that the agency failed to adequately respond to those complaints. From 1985 to 1991, fines assessed by the EPA against polluters in minority zip codes were approximately 40% lower than in white zip codes. The EPA also took longer to address hazardous sites in minority communities than in white ones, and polluters were required to undertake more stringent cleanup measures in white communities. Oil and gas pollution. The oil and gas industry, as permitted by governmental entities, has also imposed disproportionate environmental harms on African Americans. Oil and gas extraction is associated with various carcinogenic pollutants, including benzene. Studies have shown that living near these sources elevates one's risk of cancer. Over 1 million African Americans live within half a mile of oil and gas extraction and refining facilities. African Americans are also more likely to live near fracking facilities, which create similar pollution to more traditional oil and gas facilities. The natural gas produced via fracking contains various toxins and carcinogens, including hexane, benzene, and hydrogen sulfide. These dangerous cancer-causing chemicals are emitted at the initial facilities that gather natural gas at points along the systems that move from those facilities, and at the destination plants at which they are processed, all of which occur disproportionately in Black neighborhoods. Moreover, as African Americans have grown increasingly involved in the fight against oil and gas pollution in their communities, fossil fuel companies have pushed back by arguing that the fight for environmental justice will particularly harm Black communities by robbing them of oil and gas related jobs, including through a false report that National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was opposed to a clean energy plan. Automobile traffic. Although not specific to one particular industry, African Americans are also subject to disproportionate environmental harms as a result of automobile traffic. Some African Americans live in areas with more than double the traffic density of white neighborhoods and experience the highest traffic density of any racial or ethnic group. As a result, many African Americans are exposed to more on-road sources of carcinogenic pollution than other racial or ethnic groups. Auto pollution includes, among other things, exposure to nitrogen dioxide, NO2, which contributes to asthma and other respiratory elements. While exposure to NO2 is decreasing across all races in the United States, the percentage of increased exposure experienced by African Americans as compared to white Americans has changed little. Moreover, among all pollution sources nationwide, African Americans are more disproportionately exposed to air pollution attributable to construction than as to any other air pollution source. Lead poisoning. Also not specific to any industry, lead pollution is disproportionately high in Black communities that were officially segregated through federal redlining. Although this has been known for decades, commentators have noted that surprisingly little research has examined the extent of the problem. The toxic lead exposure comes from the myriad sources that are found in greater amounts in Black neighborhoods, including toxic industrial sites near to residences. Exposure to lead from outside the home can be through lead water pipes, gasoline exhaust, and nearby smelting plants. Even though most smelting plants that created lead pollution have been closed since the 1960s, soil pollution surrounding these facilities remains an active problem. Nationally, Black children are 3 times as likely to have elevated blood rates of lead, and these patterns have persisted even as lead exposure rates have decreased for children of other races and ethnicities. These disparities are even more dramatic in some areas with older housing stock. For example, a 2004 report found that in Chicago, Black children were 5 to 12 times more likely to exhibit lead poisoning than white children. This is partially because Black Chicagoans are disproportionately located in older housing stock with deteriorating lead-based paint. All of these forms of environmental pollution have serious health consequences, resulting in chronic illness like diabetes, asthma, and heart disease, and affecting maternal health and educational outcomes. African Americans suffer disproportionately from these health problems. Moreover, these health consequences persist long after exposure, with at least one study showing substantial central nervous system defects 11 years after childhood exposure. For further discussion of disparities in health outcomes not specific to environmental pollution, see Chapter 12, Mental and Physical Harm and Neglect. California. Historically, federal public housing was explicitly created to segregate Black Californians into areas with greater pollution burdens due to immediately adjacent polluting sources. For example, when the federal government built public housing in Richmond to accommodate ship workers, as discussed above, it placed the temporary housing for Black workers by the railroad tracks and shipbuilding areas. subjecting them to particulate matter. For example, small cancer-causing particles associated with diesel exhaust, and industrial pollution, but built higher quality housing for white workers further inland. Many areas within California still demonstrate racial disparities traceable to state and federal government action. Studies throughout the 1900s have found that largely Black and Latino people in Los Angeles are the most heavily impacted by pollution and toxic waste sites. Neighborhoods that were explicitly redlined by federal agencies in the 1930s, ranging from South Stockton to West Oakland to Wilmington in Los Angeles, continue to have some of the highest average pollution levels in the state. The historically Black area of Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco has a long history of environmental racism, with Black residents subjected to myriad environmental harms, including radioactive contamination from a nearby shipyard, not experienced by wider, wealthier areas within San Francisco. Moreover, recent environmental remediation efforts have come hand in hand with a substantial decline in the percentage of Black residents. Starting in the 20th century, Black residents of the neighborhood were displaced by Latino and Asian American residents. Although this has largely been attributed to the dot-com boom and rising housing prices across San Francisco, scholars have offered a variety of discriminatory factors that drove Black residents out. These include the San Francisco Housing Authority's demolition of public housing, the San Francisco Police Department's enforcement of gang injunctions, and the issuance of subprime mortgage loans. As one longtime Black resident described it, the formerly polluted community in which she had long lived is now dramatically cleaner, but is no longer meant for, quote, her or for her grandchildren, end quote. Similarly, divisions between the wealthier white hills of Oakland, California, and the poorer Black flats that were first established by federal redlining have remained today, with Black residents of the low-lying areas still subject to far greater environmental pollutants. In Oakland's earlier days, redlining placed Black Californians in these flats, adjacent to various heavy industries and manufacturing centers, acknowledging that the housing available was of low quality and subject to noticeable industrial odors. From the 1950s through the 1980s, substantial freeway construction projects placed substantial pollution burdens on all of the low-lying areas in Oakland, including in the few parks and other green space available to them. Residents of these areas continue to experience quantifiably greater health consequences, such as emergency room visits due to asthma. Pause. Shout out to the Bay Area family. Hopefully there'll be some proposals for environmental racism. Let's continue. These patterns exist across California with respect to facilities that handle hazardous waste. Los Angeles has 1.2 million people living near facilities that handle hazardous waste, and 91% of them are people of color. African Americans live near hazardous waste facilities at rates higher than other people of color as a whole. This is true elsewhere in California, leading to increased lifetime cancer risks for Black Californians that correlate with exposure to outdoor air toxins. As is the case nationwide, the oil and gas industry disproportionately affects Black Californians. More than 2 million Californians live within 2,500 feet of an unplugged oil or gas well, with greater percentages of African Americans living near these sources of pollution than the California population as a whole. Aside from the exposure to carcinogenic chemicals involved with oil and gas production, toxic residues brought up by subterranean drilling can contaminate local aquifers that supply drinking water. In the greater Los Angeles area, notable oil production exists in Inglewood and Baldwin Hills areas, which have a greater Black population than Los Angeles generally. Facts, seen it with my own eyes. Let's continue. Similar patterns exist in San Francisco Bay Area, with major oil production facilities in Richmond and Martinez, areas that are disproportionately black when compared to the broader Bay Area. All right, quick pause. All right, so we actually did talk about environmental racism in the Reparations Now documentary. However, it probably won't make it into the final cut. So what we might end up doing is actually creating a full website for the Reparations Now documentary, because there's just so much information we had to pack in to the documentary that we couldn't fully expose all this information. So anyway, just wanted to put that out there. But yeah, we are still diligently working on it, pretty close to the final cut. And so anyway, let's get back to it. Moreover, advocates have argued that public officials are more responsive. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back. I didn't finish my thought. Let me finish my thought, because I'm trying to do multitask so many times. What I meant to say is we're going to have a lot more. We're going to have probably a director's cut, and then probably more of the interviews that we have, the full version of the interviews. Because obviously the final edit is going to be truncated, at least a theatrical release. So anyway, hopefully that makes sense and I clarified myself. Let's get back to it. Moreover, advocates have argued that public officials are more responsive to oil and gas related health concerns from residents of whiter, wealthier neighborhoods, noting that the methane leak in the wealthy Porter Ranch neighborhood of Los Angeles elicited a massive statewide response, while hundreds of significant health complaints related to the Allen Company drilling site in the largely black neighborhood Jefferson Park were ignored for years. Even for industries that do not inherently involve toxic or carcinogenic materials, increased rates of truck traffic and general industrial activity also led to higher rates of heavy metal contamination of local soils. Those soils are disproportionately found in the backyards, playgrounds, and urban gardens of Black Californians. This heavy metal contamination poses a wide range of serious health consequences, including increased susceptibility to asthma, inflammation, pregnancy complications, high blood pressure, osteoporosis, kidney damage, and even Parkinson's disease. It also can prevent safe urban gardening in neighborhoods that would desperately benefit from it. On average, Black Californians breathe in about 40% more particulate matter from cars, trucks, and buses than white Californians. Black Californians are exposed to a higher amount of PM 2.5 fine particles emitted by diesel engines at a rate of 43% higher than white Californians, the highest rate of any racial or ethnic group. Black Californians also are exposed to disproportionately high levels of air pollution from other infrastructure-related non-mobile sources such as shipyards, factories, warehouses, and aviation. These sources of air pollution are a primary reason that African Americans have the highest rates of asthma among all groups in California, leading to asthma-related deaths at a rate of 2 to 3 times higher than any other racial or ethnic group. Exposure to small particulate matter from cars, trucks, buses is also tied to increased risk of heart and lung disease. Pause. Okay. So real quick, family, I just came to me. I don't know if they're going to also talk about, or I can't remember if they talked about it previously, but if they don't talk about it here in the report, at least for the upcoming future, and I'm trying to think positive about this future of the Freedmen's Bureau, that we should also include, we also talk about health and mental, but specifically like diet, right? Dietary regimen. I know that's not part of this particular chapter, but I think that's something that I just wanted to note in there, because I'm just going to keep it real. right now. What we call soul food, family, you know what I'm talking about? Think we've gotten a lot better, but soul food ain't necessarily the soul food that we should be consuming. All right. So, with that note, that's a little interjection, but yeah, we as, you know, black folk, freedmen folk, not all of us, some of us are trying to eat more healthier than we can, but I think we should definitely have some sort of dietitian available, especially, you know, within the freedmen community, because we can all learn, right? Anyway, let's get back to it. Climate change. Research on the concrete and worsening effects of climate change has made clear that harmful health and environment-related effects of climate change will be experienced by all Americans. These effects include, just interjection, not only all Americans, but globally too. So let's just do a quick interjection, but anyway, back to it. These effects include increased range and incidence of infectious disease vectors like ticks, mosquitoes, and avian-borne pathogens, and decreased food quality and security. Rising sea levels will damage coastal communities and reduce water quality and availability. Extreme, just quick interjection. If you haven't checked out our last In the News that we did, the special report, Governor Gavin Newsom in California is actually working on some type of process to extract seawater. So, you know, California can provide more quality water here. So I just wanted to put that in. So family, if you haven't checked out our special report that we did a while back, we actually talk about that in the news report. So anyway, let's continue. Extreme weather events like floods, storms, fires, and extreme heat waves are projected to occur more frequently and more severely. All Americans will be at risk of these harms, but not all will face that risk equally. Communities that have already socially and economically struggling, including the urban poor, communities of color, the elderly and children, agricultural workers, and rural health consequences, including increased susceptibility to asthma, inflation. Okay, so I already read that. And rural communities will shoulder a disproportionate burden of these hazards nationally. Nationally, formerly redline areas consistently show hotter temperatures than other areas. Therefore, climate change is certain to exacerbate existing, historically codified disparities that track existing housing-related harms experienced by African Americans. In particular, so-called heat islands, which will worsen due to climate change, exist where built-up urban areas have few trees, vegetation, or parks that serve to dissipate or reflect heat, and instead have pavement and building materials that absorb and retain it. Boom. Federal Environmental Protection Agency studies have found that the heat island effect can cause urban areas to be up to 7 degrees hotter than outlying areas during the day and up to 5 degrees hotter at night. Let's see where we're at. African Americans disproportionately live in such heat islands, experiencing higher temperatures on extreme heat days due to a lack of adequate tree cover. In a study of 108 urban areas nationwide, including several in California, the formerly redline neighborhoods of nearly every city studied were hotter than the non-redline neighborhoods, some by nearly 13 degrees. Aside from tree cover, other features of the urban landscape in Black neighborhoods, most notably roadways and large building complexes, also absorb and slowly release heat, which also exacerbate heat islands and their effects as discussed above. The greater presence of trees in a community has been shown to correlate with lower asthma rates, fewer hospital visits during the heat waves, and improved mental health for the community's residents. There are a variety of reasons for this, but the most significant is the prevalence of shade that trees create, lowering temperatures and providing a less oppressive environment during particularly hot days. I just real quick interjection. I think they call the Sacramento City of Trees, and that's one thing I could say about Sacramento here in California is that Sacramento, except for the parts that don't have a lot of trees, I mean, you could really feel that heat kicking, especially during the summer. But yeah, comparatively speaking in Los Angeles, I mean, I know Los Angeles has a lot of palm trees, but more so in the affluent areas, there might be more trees there. But yeah, Los Angeles has to do a lot better job because it's an urban jungle in a lot of that city down in Los Angeles. So anyway, let's continue. Conversely, the heightened temperatures in heat islands has led to higher rates of heat-related adverse pregnancy consequences for Black women, including premature births and stillbirths. Elected officials have recognized that the issue of shade and heat islands is connected to social justice, with those facing the greatest risk as a result of these disparities often being the most vulnerable members of a community. The association between parks and green space with healthier, wider neighborhoods is so strong that even modern efforts to add green space to largely Black neighborhoods sometimes involve racist narratives, with local efforts portraying green revitalization plans as benefiting primarily white residents, even in Black neighborhoods. Such revitalization plans can also lead to the backlash and suffering of Black residents in these gentrifying neighborhoods. For example, they can be treated as suspicious by local government and new residents when they take advantage of newly constructed parks and other green space. Black residents of areas without tree cover have also faced gentrification and unaffordability as a consequence, intentional or advertent, of local government efforts to add green space. All right, fam. I'm just going to pause there real quick. Just kind of seeing where we're at here. We're going to start on California. I'm going to change the music up a little bit, and so we get this thing popping. Let's see. Let's do this one. All right, let's go back to it. Thanks, family, for coming through. Appreciate everyone in the building. Of course, Kim. What's up, Darlene? My man Theo, salute, bro. What's going on? Shonda, what's up, fam? Appreciate you. All right, let's get back to it. California. Black Californians experience these disproportionate harms in many ways, many attributable to the decisions of state and local governments. As is the case nationally, redlining had the effect of clustering Black Californians in urban centers that often constitute heat islands, and the worsening heat waves caused by climate change will impose disproportionate health burdens on Black Californians. A 2009 report published by the University of Southern California, The Climate Gap, found that Black residents of Los Angeles are already almost twice as likely to die during a heat wave or other residents because of the heat islands attributable to a history of redlining and segregation. According to the California Department of Public Health, Black Californians are 52% more likely than white Californians to live in areas where more than half the ground is covered by impervious surfaces like asphalt and concrete, and where more than half the population lacks tree canopy. By definition, the characteristics of a heat island. This disparity is particularly pronounced in the greater Los Angeles area, where wealthier white areas have triple the amount of tree cover compared to poorer Black neighborhoods. This may be directly attributable to government action, since the city of Los Angeles intentionally kept tree growth to a minimum in Black communities where police officers expressed a concern, realistic or not, that trees could serve as places to hide drugs or weapons. The California Department of Public Health has warned that as heat waves begin earlier in the season and last longer, heat-related deaths are growing disproportionately more common for certain racial or ethnic groups, particularly Black Californians. Exacerbating these harms, Black Californians are less likely to have air conditioning, a car to access cooler areas, government-sponsored cooling stations, and are more likely to have one or more chronic health conditions. For example, in South Los Angeles, a disproportionately Black neighborhood, nearly 3/5 of households did not have air conditioning in 2020, a number which has not substantially changed over the past decade, even as heat waves worsen. These patterns have been seen across the state during heat waves in which Black Californians' rates of emergency medical visits and hospitalizations compared to white Californians. All right. Infrastructure and public services. Nationally and within California, African Americans have suffered disproportionate harms, both environment and otherwise, a result of governmental investment and neglect relating to infrastructure and public services. Neglected water systems. While Black communities across the U.S. face these infrastructure disparities daily, the crisis of water quality and lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan is an example of governmental neglect that led to the poisoning of a Black community. Flint, Michigan, in Genesee County, which is now a majority Black city, was originally populated largely by white workers for the General Motors Corporation, which recruited workers in the 1920s and 1930s through housing. It built itself and then sold subject to restrictive covenants preventing sale to non-white persons. Private discrimination was cemented and continued through federal redlining in the 1940s, as GM also discriminated in the jobs it offered to the few Black residents of Flint, who generally worked as janitorial staff. However, starting in the 1960s, as a larger Black population arrived, pockets of Flint experienced, quote, white flight, end quote, which accelerated dramatically across Flint through the 1970s as the automotive industry suffered. In 2014, the entire city of Flint decided to switch its drinking water source from Detroit's system to the Flint River to save money. Residents thereafter complained for months that their water both smelled and appeared worse, but city and state officials continued to maintain the water was safe for human consumption, even as they explicitly chose not to test the water's safety. After a leaked internal memo from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency reported high levels of lead due to the coercivity of the Flint River water, state officials continued to falsely maintain the levels were safe and called the federal report an outlier. By the time Flint switched back to Detroit's water system, children were exposed to massive amounts of lead with potentially irreversible health consequences for both young children and those exposed in utero through their mothers. Wow. Those consequences included learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and behavioral problems. Again, because Flint had become a majority Black city at the time of the crisis, these impacts were experienced by Black Michiganders far more than other groups. Even in 2017, after years of attention and remediation, Flint's water still has higher rates of lead than 98% of the rest of the state. Studies show that the amount of children in Flint with lead pollution in their blood almost doubled as a result of the crisis. While both state officials and Michigan Governor Rick Snyder continue to downplay the issue, the Michigan State Attorney General has attributed responsibility for the crisis to all levels of state and local government, filing criminal charges against various state and local officials, including former Governor Snyder. The charges range from perjury related to actions designed to cover up malfeasance to manslaughter. In early 20th century New York, Black residents were forced to live in lowland areas near drainage pools for sewage, while white residents lived in higher ground with better drainage. As a result, black people died from malaria at much higher rates than white people and experienced higher rates of diseases like dysentery and typhoid. Similar patterns existed across the South as well. Across the nation, as residential segregation increased throughout the 20th century, black neighborhoods actually lost access to water and sewer municipal services, since it enabled municipalities to more easily prioritize white over black neighborhoods for better services. These disparities continue today. As recently as 2019, New York City acknowledged its responsibility for a massive leak caused by a collapsed pipe in a largely black neighborhood of Queens, which flooded 127 homes with raw sewage. Wow. Many of these houses were destroyed or severely damaged, losses that were not covered by basic homeowners or rental insurance. Pause. Jackson, Mississippi. Let's go. Inadequate sewage systems. Historically, African Americans were subjected to environmental and health consequences as a result of failure to equitably construct sewer and other waste management systems. Originally, U.S. cities relied on private waterworks. By the mid-19th century, cities across America began substantial investment in constructing modern sanitary sewer and garbage removal systems. However, black neighborhoods were not provided with such systems as early or at all as compared to white neighborhoods. In fact, the impetus for provision of such services to black neighborhoods was sometimes to prevent diseases that resulted from the lack of such services from crossing from black neighborhoods into white ones. Rates of illnesses and death resulting from poor sewage disposal dramatically diverged for black and white Americans, as the latter gained access to effective sewage systems while the former did not. For example, let's see where we're at. For example, neighborhood of Queens, which flooded 127. For example, where are we at here? For example, in early 20th century New York, black residents were forced to live in lowland areas. Hold on a second, family. Make sure I got this right. Okay, I think I read that up at the top, so we're going to skip that and go down to energy burdens. Energy burdens. African Americans nationally are subject to disproportionately higher rates and disproportionately poor service with respect to the electrical grid. Black households in America spend more on residential energy bills than white households, even when controlling for income, household size, and other possibly relevant factors. Across the country, African Americans shoulder energy burdens that are disproportionately larger than any other racial group, meaning they spend a larger portion of their income on energy. This is true in major California cities as well, such as Los Angeles and San Francisco. These disproportionate costs are partially attributed to African Americans living in older, energy inefficient homes as a result of the legacy of redlining and other discriminatory housing policies. Low-income African Americans are also twice as likely to have their utility service shut off as similarly low-income white Americans, which advocates have argued are the result of inflexible shutoff of regulations and disproportionate energy burdens. Because of lower rates of home ownership in the black community, African Americans also often cannot take advantage of programs aimed at lessening energy burdens that require home ownership to utilize, such as home solar panels or installation of free charging stations for electric vehicles. As discussed in more detail above, African Americans also suffer disproportionate burdens related to the production of energy, as power plants, including those fired by coal, continue to be disproportionately located in the neighborhoods, producing particulate matter emissions that cause damage to the heart, lungs, and brain. Racist transportation systems. Federal, state, and local governments have consistently failed to offer equitable transit options for Black communities throughout American history. The earliest form of transportation discrimination was the trafficking of Black Africans in slave ships. Boom. Discussed more fully in Chapter 2, Enslavement. The federal government allowed and regulated this form of human trafficking until 1808. Officially, until 1808. Let's continue. When the importation of enslaved people was outlawed. By the late 1700s, the Underground Railroad, an organized effort of safe houses and activists, helped transport enslaved people to freedom. Between 1810 and 1850, the Underground Railroad freed an estimated 100,000 enslaved persons. Around the same time, both the South and the North segregated travelers by race. Frederick Douglass was often dragged out of his seat, beaten and severely bruised by conductors and brakemen when he refused to ride in the Jim Crow car as he rode trains in New England. The federal government supported these segregation efforts even as some states attempted to desegregate. For example, in 1877, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a Louisiana civil rights law requiring the desegregation of transport as unconstitutional. Decker, a Black woman, bought a first-class ticket on a steamboat, but was sent to the second-class cabin because first class was for whites only. The court overturned a decision from the Louisiana Supreme Court to award legal damages to Decker based on a state law requiring desegregated transport, holding that Louisiana had no authority to regulate such transport. Damn. In 1896, in contrast, the United States Supreme Court explicitly permitted segregation in public transit when it upheld Louisiana's law requiring transportation segregation. This history of government segregation set the stage for unequal transportation for African Americans that continues to the present. At the turn of the century, subsidized by government funds, private companies constructed mass transit systems in American cities. Until around the 1950s, nearly all transit was built and operated by private companies. Many transit companies struggled to remain profitable in the 1920s, especially after the Depression. The widespread adoption of the automobile combined with white Americans moved to the suburbs, as described in Chapter 5. Housing segregation resulted in the company's financial failure. Public transit systems cut back services as masses of white riders left the system. It never expanded to the suburbs. As government and private actors erected barriers to prevent African Americans from moving to the suburbs, poor Black workers without cars were left with few public transportation options. When manufacturers and industrial jobs moved from the urban centers to suburban or rural areas, urban Black workers were often unable to follow due to lack of transportation options. Okay, quick interjection. I don't know about y'all, but if y'all in the market for buying a car right now, man, even used car prices have gone up because of, inflation and this pandemic. Insane. Anyway, let's continue. In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. described how city planning decisions result in transportation systems that failed Black communities. Urban transit systems in most American cities have become a genuine civil rights issue and a valid one, because the layout of rapid transit systems determines accessibility of jobs to the Black community. If transportation systems in American cities could be laid out so as to provide an opportunity for poor people to get meaningful employment, then they could begin to move into the mainstream of American life. The federal government has been aware of this failure to support transportation for the Black urban workforce, but has not provided a remedy. In 1968, the report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, also known as the Kerner Commission Report, studied the causes and effects of riots in U.S. cities. In order to enhance employment opportunities for central city residents. The report recommended the creation of improved transportation links between Black urban neighborhoods and new job locations in the suburbs. Quick interjection. I believe maybe on one of our programs here on in the Mass Media Group, I think we did talk about creating some kind of transportation division within our new Freedmen's Bureau. I believe, if not, family out there, we need to take note that we should definitely add that into some proposals for our community. So let's continue. In the 1960s and 70s, the federal government began providing funding for public transit, and many municipalities took control of transit operations. However, scholars argue that these revitalized agencies built a segregated system. The municipal transit agencies that were created throughout the 70s and into the 80s were designed to be responsive to the demands of the local communities, demands which had often ground re-segregationists as a backlash to the civil rights movement. This created transit systems that were unequal by design. Municipal agencies did not cater to urban riders who relied exclusively on public transit, instead challenging grading resources to entice mostly white suburban commuters who could also choose to drive. This translated to less comfortable seats, unshaded waiting areas, and bumpier, more unpleasant rides for Black users of public transit. This system continues to operate today. African Americans still rely on public transit to get to work at much higher rates than white workers. Black workers commute by public transit at nearly 4 times the rate of white workers. Moreover, Black workers on average experience higher commute times than white workers, both nationally and in California. Finally, since most fares are usually flat, low-income people pay a higher share of their monthly salary on transit, which is more likely to impact African Americans and other people of color. Due to these government actions, workers relying on public transit, who are more often Black than white, often pay comparatively more money and commute for a larger amount of time if they are able to use transit to get to jobs at all. In addition to discrimination in the public transit system, as discussed in Chapter 5, our country's highway system destroyed Black neighborhoods and intensified residential segregation by separating Black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods. All right, real quick pause. I don't know if y'all in the comments want to talk about wherever you guys live in California, the transportation system, or if you're on the East Coast or South or wherever y'all coming from. But I know, man, like here in Sacramento, it's gotten a little better, but it's pretty bad. In LA is not bad depending on where you go, but I mean, LA is so like huge that you know, sometimes, especially on the bus routes, it takes forever to get a bus. I know down in San Francisco, the BART, I think the BART's pretty good, but I heard in New York has, you know, a lot of people rely on the public transit system, so I heard it's pretty reliable out there. I don't know if the Boston family, if we got anybody from Boston, but I heard Boston's okay. I could be totally off about that as well, because I ain't been to Boston, but I'm just throwing it out there. So anyway, let's continue. Disparities in telecom. Oh, just real quick interjection. I think the last time I went back down to Los Angeles, I think they're actually building, Caltrans or the Metro down there is actually building something, a transition away from somewhere down in like South LA area, which more of the Black community lives, to like, I think it was somewhere that stops like around like the Western Avenue area-ish, which is probably somewhere around like the Beverly Hills area, going down to the Wilshire area. So I think they're building, been around that area in like many years, like 5 or 6, but I think the last time they're building it. So I think LA is really trying to, do something about their transportation system, having it more better basically than it was, some 10, even 15 years ago. But comparatively speaking, especially here in Sacramento, I mean, it's a lot better. Anyway, let's continue. Disparities in telecom. African Americans also face disproportionate burdens with respect to the National Telecommunications Network. From 1960 through 2010, African Americans have had significantly lower rates of telephone access than white Americans, though this gap has reduced over time as telephone use became more ubiquitous. More recently, fewer African Americans have access to broadband internet access than white Americans. A 2021 study in Indiana revealed that 56.2% of Black residents lacked reliable access to internet service and or a computer, compared to 34.8% of white residents. This lack of telecommunications impact economic and educational opportunities. Black teens are almost twice as likely to report that they cannot complete all their homework due to lack of access to a computer or reliable internet access. Let's see. Quick interjection. Especially during the pandemic, when schools were shut down and, most places weren't open. Like, man, I know it was impacting our community specifically hard in those, lower income communities for a fact. Because they didn't even have libraries open. I mean, it was horrible. So I know a lot of students, hopefully, they're able to graduate, if they were juniors or seniors around that time. It was bad. Fortunately with my kids, I think their internet was okay. But yeah, I know for a lot of kids, which we also did rely on the public, library too at times for internet access, and the public libraries were shut down. So like it was horrible. Anyway, let's continue. In addition to difficulty accessing the internet, African Americans are disadvantaged by racist structures within it. Dr. Yeshima Biet Melner, probably totally botched that, but I'm trying to do my best here, testified to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans that search algorithms, machine learning, automated resource allocation systems, and even credit reporting agencies are all built by software engineers that are overwhelmingly white. As a result, the implicit biases of these human software engineers have been built into seemingly neutral algorithms and artificial intelligence with the discriminatory effects. For example, in 2016, when Amazon Prime same-day delivery services were introduced in Atlanta, Georgia, virtually 100% of white residents were given access to the service, but less than half of Black residents did. What? Similar patterns existed for Black residents of Boston and Chicago. California authorized segregated public transportation at least until 1864. The governments of California and its municipalities have chosen infrastructure projects that have harmed Black communities. While California and federal law require state and municipal agencies to consider racially disparate impacts of infrastructure projects today, the historical damage caused by highways in particular has contributed to higher exposure to air pollution among communities of color, as discussed above. As with the federal government, California's government historically neglected water infrastructures as it applied to Black Californians. One example is California's treatment of Black families fleeing the Dust Bowl. These families left the prairie states and came to farmland across California starting in the 1930s, experiencing widespread infrastructure discrimination from state and local governments. Real quick pause. I know my family on the Great Migration around the 1940s, I think, late 40s, mid 40s, to the early 50s came through from Kansas and Oklahoma. And I know a lot of Black folk came there. So I'm sure my family was impacted by this as well. So let's continue. For example, Black Californians in the San Joaquin Valley were excluded from most urban areas with access to clean water as a result of explicit redlining policies, racially restrictive housing covenants, and even racially motivated violence. In Tulare County, the largely Black community of Tavistan had no access to sewer and water infrastructure, while the adjacent white community of Pixley did. Again, the discrimination continued until recently. The town of Lanier, also formed by Black families fleeing the Dust Bowl, had no running water until the 1970s. Oh my gosh. And was subjected to dangerous levels of arsenic in the water even after wells and pipes were drilled. The town's residents did not get access to clean drinking water until 2019. I haven't repeated a lot of things tonight, but I'm going to repeat this one. The town's residents did not get access to clean drinking water until 2019. At times, government entities were explicit in weaponizing infrastructure against Black Californians. For example, in the 1950s, a developer in Milpitas, a town north of San Jose, sought to build a large housing development open to both white and Black homebuyers. He managed to overcome several zoning-related obstacles, only to discover that Milpitas City Council had increased the sewer connection fee more than tenfold, explicitly to thwart the development. Black neighborhoods in California still suffer extremely high rates of water pollution in the water provided through government infrastructure. In 2019, the New York Times reported that as many as 1,000 community water systems in California may be at high risk of failing to deliver potable water, with a disproportionate number of these systems located in low-income areas that tend to be disproportionately Black. California's Environmental Protection Agency has also acknowledged that contamination of water sources disproportionately impacts communities of color. A UCLA report in 2021 identified 29 failing water systems in Los Angeles County, and these systems largely service communities of color. For example, in 2019, authorities dissolved the Sativa, Los Angeles County Water District, for serving brown water for decades to its customers in Willowbrook in the historically Black neighborhood of Compton. In Oakland, the majority Black McClemens High School has had a history of serious water contamination issues in recent years, from lead population to dangerously high levels of chemical solvent groundwater pollution that lead to the school's temporary closure in 2020. Wow. Transportation discrimination impacts Black Californians as well. In 1965, the California governor created the McCone Commission to examine causes of civil unrest in Los Angeles in 1965, identifying inadequate and costly transportation as contributing to high rates of unemployment among the Black urban population. California has not designed its transportation system to address this need, often favoring rail options catering to suburbs rather than bus lines used by urban areas with greater Black populations. These choices have led to several high-profile lawsuits, including in Los Angeles and San Francisco in the 1990s and 2000s. Nevertheless, design of public transit by major municipalities in the state often catered to the largely white suburban residents because they were seen as needing better options in order to, quote, choose, end quote, public transit. For example, Oakland's San Antonio neighborhood, the most racially diverse in the city and one of the densest parts of the Bay Area, sees the Bay Area Rapid Transit, known as BART, travel for nearly 3 miles apart, nearly 3 miles without stopping. By contrast, in suburban Walnut Creek and Pleasant Hill, which are less than half as dense, BART stations are only 1 3/4 miles apart. In the late 1960s, BART was literally designed to hurry white suburban commuters past black inner city neighborhoods and residents. This purposeful decision by the government left black residents without the same transit options to reach jobs and limited economic mobility and opportunity. In Oakland, a $484 million elevated people mover, which connects BART to the airport, lost federal funding because it was found to have a discriminatory impact. Its construction led to the elimination of a bus route in the minority neighborhoods it bypasses. But though the project lost federal funding, it still went ahead, and the Oakland neighborhood still lost its bus line. Finally, although the disparities between black and white residents in terms of raw internet access in California is much smaller than nationally, research has shown that black neighborhoods in both Los Angeles and Oakland had the least investment in broadband internet in those cities. Conclusion. The various forms of environment and infrastructure related discrimination suffered by African Americans in this country are rooted in the badges and incidences of slavery that have never been eliminated in this country. Black enslaved persons were released from bondage and forced into unhealthy, dangerous, and overcrowded housing located in the most toxic areas in our cities, which also lacked proper water and sewage services. Residential segregation and government decisions regarding modern infrastructure development reinforce these patterns throughout the 20th century. African Americans have been denied equal access to telecommunication services and are increasingly subjected to algorithms and other forms of computerized decision-making with racist underpinnings and outcomes. These racist systems have harmed and will continue to harm African Americans. Okay, that concludes this chapter 7. But just real quick, fam, before we get out of here, for those that are living in California, I could be wrong, but I think statistically, there's a lot of people who drive here in California, comparatively speaking, to the bus systems, right? And I mean, if you kind of don't even have a car out here, I mean, sometimes you could be just stuck. And I don't even know what people were doing during, this whole pandemic thing. If they had to get somewhere and they didn't have a car, because I know some, transit systems, I think they were kind of running. I think they were supposed to be running, but even some routes were like shut down. And anyway, it was just crazy. And I can't remember because, I didn't do the Uber Lyft thing or whatever, but I mean, even with Uber and Lyft, trying to transport people. And that's another thing we should probably look into, is like how much people are actually paying, especially black people, and those who, don't have a lot of money and not transportation, actually how much they're actually spending a year on Uber and Lyft. I'd be very interested to see how much, goes into that. And maybe that's something that, the freedmen community, once we get our reparations, maybe we need to, do our own Uber services and Lyft services. You know what I mean? So, yeah, let me just go through some of these comments real quick. Yeah, so it looks like they're building more trains in LA. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, they need to, because, man. All right. Okay, so they just opened in Crenshaw. Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah, facts. Transit so bad in Sac, they just like pay for bus routes. Like rail expansion ain't working out. Yeah, it's crazy, man. As I said before, there's just a lot of, cars, on the road out here in California. and it's just nutty. So I'm just gonna put just put in the notes here, Uber and Lyft data for Black customers who, yeah, because I'm just curious, family, on like how much we're actually spending, a year on these services, especially ones that don't have cars, right? Yeah, it's just nuts. Anyway, family, y'all have a wonderful night. Thanks for joining, and for those who are going to listen to this on the replay, please like, share, and subscribe. We're going to be back at it again. Let's see what is for the upcoming chapter 8 is going to be pathologizing Black families. This is going to be interesting. I don't know if it's going to be a part 1, part 2 or not, but we'll see tomorrow. Once again, check us out this Sunday. We're going to have a wonderful build. Please like and share. Once again, this Sunday at 11 a.m., we might be opening up the lines, family, so y'all can come through, speak your speech, say what you must say, and probably tomorrow we're going to be posting this wonderful interview behind the scenes in LA with our brother Milagro Jones, currently a student at UCLA. I can't exactly remember what he's studying, some kind of like rap something, or something dealing with music. Anyway, I know he says that in the behind the scenes. So everybody have a wonderful night. Be safe. Love yourself. Love your family. Take care of yourself. And on that note, love, peace, and reparations. And until next time, y'all be easy.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have Black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total Black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, but I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically Black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.